Nikolai Masalov bought a box of matches at a corner store in the 1960s. On the matchbox was a photograph, a massive bronze soldier holding a child. He looked at the soldier's face. Something about it seemed familiar. The uniform, the posture, the way the head tilted. And then it hit him. That face was his face. For nearly 20 years, his likeness had stood 12 meters tall in Berlin's Treptower Park, one of the Cold War's most iconic monuments, and he had no idea. But here's the problem. The sculptor said it never happened. The marshal said it did. One claimed the 12-meter bronze statue standing in Berlin's Treptower Park was purely symbolic, a representation of Soviet virtue, nothing more. The other insisted it immortalized a specific act of heroism on April 30th, 1945, when a Soviet sergeant crawled through machine gun fire to rescue a German child trapped in no man's land. Both men were there, both men saw the war, and both men told completely different stories about what became one of the most iconic monuments of the 20th century. This isn't just a story about a statue. It's about how history gets written, rewritten, and weaponized, how a single act of mercy became propaganda, how truth and myth became so tangled that even 70 years later, historians can't fully separate them, and how one man discovered by accident that his face was cast in bronze and immortalized when he bought a box of matches at a corner store. In the next 30 minutes, you're going to discover three things. First, what actually happened on that bridge in Berlin on the same day Hitler died. Second, why a 12-meter monument required 1,200 workers, 200 stonemasons, and 90 sculptors to build, and why Stalin personally changed the design. And third, how a kindergarten janitor became the unwilling centerpiece of one of the Cold War's most contested stories. By the end, you'll understand why sometimes the most interesting historical question isn't what happened. It's who gets to say what it means. If you want to understand how monuments shape memory and how memory shapes nations, hit that like button. It tells YouTube to share this with people who care about the complicated truth behind the simple stories we tell about war. Let's start with what we know for certain. In Berlin's Treptower Park stands a bronze colossus, 12 meters tall, 70 tons of metal. A Soviet soldier, larger than life, holding a German child in one arm and a lowered sword in the other. His boot rests on a shattered swastika. The child looks up at him with absolute trust. Behind them, the names of 5,000 Soviet soldiers who died taking Berlin. The memorial opened on May 8, 1949, exactly 4 years after Germany's surrender. Over 1,200 workers spent 3 years building the complex. 200 stonemasons carved the granite. 90 sculptors contributed to the massive Anneau project. The statue alone required technical engineering that pushed the limits of what was possible with 1940s Soviet metalworking. It wasn't just a monument, it was a statement about Soviet power, Soviet sacrifice, and Soviet mercy. For decades, visitors assumed they knew the story. A Soviet soldier saved a German girl. The statue commemorated that moment. Simple, heroic, true. Except the sculptor, Yevgeny Vukatich, said something different in multiple interviews. The soldier and child were merely a symbolic image, he explained. He had no concrete event in mind. The figure represented an ideal, Soviet magnanimity, the triumph of humanity over fascism. Not a specific soldier, not a specific child, a symbol. But Marshal Vasily Chuikov, the commander who accepted Berlin's surrender, a man whose military credentials were unquestionable, said the statue commemorated Sergeant Nikolai Masalov's deed. He described it in detail in his memoir, The Fall of Berlin, published in 1965. He claimed he witnessed it personally. Machine guns firing, Masalov crawling across open ground, a child crying, and a decision that could have ended with a bullet. So who's right? The artist who created it or the general who claimed to see it? And why does it matter? Here's why it matters. In 1999, German historians discovered that another story about another Soviet soldier named Lukyanovich, who supposedly rescued a child, was completely fabricated. A fraud. The soldier never existed. The story was propaganda, pure and simple. When that plaque came down, officials scrambled to replace it with something real. They chose Masalov. They installed a bronze plaque at Potsdamer Bridge in 2003, declaring him the prototype for the Treptower Monument. But if the sculptor himself said the statue wasn't based on a real event, what exactly were they memorializing? That's the question we're going to answer. Not with simple certainty, but with the complicated truth. Because this story, like most stories about war, lives in the space between what happened, what people said happened, what people needed to believe happened, and what governments wanted everyone to think happened. To understand what happened on April 30th, 1945, you need to understand what Berlin had become by then. Not a city anymore, a battlefield, a death trap. The Soviet army had surrounded it 16 days earlier. Over 80,000 Soviet soldiers would die in the battle, more than 22,000 in the final assault alone. The fighting was building to building, room to room, snipers on every corner, artillery turning entire neighborhoods into moonscapes. General Vasily Chuikov commanded the 8th Guards Army. His forces were responsible for the final push through the Tiergarten district, the area near what had been Berlin's elegant government quarter. By April 30th, German resistance was collapsing but still lethal. Pockets of Wehrmacht and SS units fought with the desperation of men who knew surrender meant death or Siberia. Civilians trapped in cellars and rubble. No water, no power, no safe passage out. That same day, April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler shot himself in the Führerbunker, less than 2 miles from where our story takes place. The Third Reich had maybe 48 hours left to live, but in the streets, soldiers on both sides still died by the dozens. The 220th Guards Regiment was positioned to assault what remained of the Tiergarten. They were preparing for the bombardment when someone heard crying. Not an adult's cry, a child's. Coming from no man's land between Soviet and German positions near the Potsdamer Bridge that crossed the Landwehr Canal. Drop a comment if you've ever heard a sound that changed everything, because that's what happened next. Sergeant Nikolai Masalov heard it. 22 or 23 years old, records conflict on his exact birth year. He'd survived Stalingrad, fought his way through the battles at Seversky Donets, commanded a unit crossing the Dnieper River, been wounded at the Dniester, took a head wound crossing the Vistula, and kept fighting. He'd seen more death in 3 years than most people see in a lifetime, but that child's cry cut through everything. Here's where we have to be careful with the evidence. What we know with certainty comes from Marshal Chuikov's memoir, published nearly 20 years after the event. Chuikov wrote a detailed account describing Masalov's crawl across open ground in vivid detail. Quote, "Machine guns started firing. Sergeant Masalov was crawling forward, snuggling against the asphalt. From time to time, he took cover in the shallow explosion funnels created by the shells. He didn't forget to feel each bump and crack on the road to avoid landmines. He crossed the promenade and hid behind the projection of the canal's concrete wall, and then he heard the child's cry again." Chuikov's account continues. Masalov stood up, full height, medals visible on his chest, bullets and shrapnel flying around him. He reached the child, a 3-year-old girl, blonde, crying next to what appeared to be her mother's body. The mother had been killed trying to escape the fighting. Masalov grabbed the child and ran back to Soviet lines while his comrades provided covering fire. According to the account, Masalov carried the child to safety and then immediately rejoined the assault. No fanfare, no ceremony, just back to the war. Now, here's what makes this complicated. Chuikov was Masalov's commanding officer. He was there during the Battle of Berlin. His memoir has been verified as genuine. It was published in October magazine in 1965 in Moscow, then in English as The End of the Third Reich in 1969 by Ballantine Books. Multiple sources confirm the memoir exists and contains this account. But Chuikov wrote it 19 years after the event. Memory changes, details shift, and Chuikov had reasons beyond pure historical accuracy to tell this story the way he did. What we can verify independently, the 220th Guards Regiment was at Potsdamer Bridge on April 30th. The unit was preparing for an assault on the Tiergarten. Soviet and German forces were trading fire across the canal. Civilians were trapped in the area, trying to escape. Those facts appear in multiple independent sources from German and Soviet archives. The specific details of Masalov's rescue, those come primarily from Chuikov's account and later from Masalov's own recollections when he was interviewed decades later. No other soldier wrote about witnessing it, no photographs captured it, no contemporaneous reports mention it. The first public account appeared in Red Star newspaper in 1964 when they published excerpts from Chuikov's memoir. Does that mean it didn't happen? Not necessarily. Most acts of individual heroism in war go unrecorded. Battles are chaos. Soldiers are focused on survival, not documentation. The absence of immediate evidence doesn't equal fabrication. But it does mean we're relying on testimony given years after the fact by people who had reasons, professional, political, personal, to shape the story in particular ways. What we know about Masalov himself makes the story plausible. His war record shows a pattern of courage bordering on recklessness. Stalingrad alone was a meat grinder that killed over 1 million people. Surviving it required either extraordinary luck or extraordinary skill. Masalov had both. He'd been wounded multiple times, suffered at least 2 concussions, and kept fighting. The idea that he'd risk his life for a child isn't inconsistent with his documented behavior. Here's what else we know. When Soviet forces finally secured the area, they found German civilians among the dead and wounded. Women and children had been caught in the crossfire trying to escape. Medical units treated German civilians alongside Soviet soldiers. This wasn't unique to Masalov's unit. It happened throughout the Battle of Berlin. Soviet soldiers, despite the brutality of the war and despite orders that sometimes encouraged revenge against German civilians, occasionally showed mercy. Not always, not even most of the time, but sometimes. So did Nikolai Masalov rescue a German child on April 30th, 1945? The evidence suggests yes, something like that happened. The details? Those are hazier. The exact sequence of events, the specific circumstances, the precise movements described in Chuikov's account. Those might be reconstruction, elaboration, or dramatization of a more chaotic and less cinematic moment. But here's the part that makes this story fascinating. Whether the rescue happened exactly as described or not, nobody disputes that acts like this occurred. German historians have documented at least 4 Soviet soldiers who rescued children during the Battle of Berlin. 198 German women responded when authorities tried to find the girl from the monument, claiming they'd been rescued by Soviet soldiers. Many of those stories were verified. The soldiers existed. The rescues happened. In several cases, the soldiers died saving those children. If you're finding this fascinating and want to see where this goes, hit that subscribe button, because we're about to talk about how this moment, real, embellished, or somewhere in between, became 70 tons of bronze and a flashpoint for historical debates that continue today. Masalov survived the war. He went home, and for nearly 20 years, nobody knew his name. May 8th, 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe ended. Berlin lay in ruins. 3.6 million cubic meters of rubble, 75% of the city destroyed, bodies still being pulled from collapsed buildings months later. The Soviet death toll from the Battle of Berlin alone exceeded 80,000. Across the entire Eastern Front, roughly 27 million Soviet citizens died during the war, a number so staggering it defies comprehension. Within a year, Stalin decided Berlin needed a monument, not to mourn, to declare victory. The monument would serve multiple purposes, all of them political. First, it would memorialize Soviet soldiers who died taking Berlin, a genuine memorial function. Second, it would establish Soviet legitimacy as occupiers of East Berlin. You don't build a massive monument in a city you plan to leave. Third, it would communicate a specific narrative about the war, that Soviet forces were liberators, not conquerors, that they brought freedom, not occupation, that they showed mercy to German civilians even after years of Nazi atrocities on Soviet soil. That last point was critical, because by 1946, reports were already circulating about Soviet soldiers committing mass rapes and violence against German civilians during and after the conquest of Berlin. Conservative estimates suggest hundreds of thousands of German women were sexually assaulted by Red Army troops. Soviet leadership knew this threatened their narrative of righteous liberation. They needed a counter-narrative. They needed a symbol that said, "We came not just to destroy, but to save." Enter the design competition. 1946, 33 entries submitted. The winning design was a hybrid creation. Architect Yakov Belopolsky, sculptor Yevgeny Vuchetich, painter Alexander Gorpenko, and engineer Sara Walerius all contributed. But Vucetich's central statue became the defining image, a Soviet soldier. Massive, powerful, standing on a broken swastika, holding a German child, a lowered sword in his other hand. The symbolism was blunt and effective. Soviet strength shattering fascism. Soviet mercy protecting innocence. Soviet restraint, the lowered sword not raised for killing. And critically, a male protector and a female child. The soldier as father figure, not aggressor. Here's where Stalin personally intervened. Vucetich's original design showed the soldier holding a machine gun. Stalin ordered it changed to a sword. Why? Because machine guns are weapons of modern industrial war, efficient, brutal, impersonal. Swords are ancient, chivalric, noble. Knights carry swords, protectors carry swords, conquerors use machine guns. Stalin understood propaganda. The sword transformed the soldier from a combatant into a guardian. Construction began in 1946. The scope was massive. Treptower Park became a construction site covering 100,000 square meters. The memorial complex included not just the central statue, but an entire architectural landscape, a symbolic journey from death to victory to peace. Visitors would enter through massive stone portals, walk past a sculpture called Mother Russia, mourning her fallen sons, descend into a sunken memorial plaza surrounded by granite blocks with Cyrillic inscriptions, and finally arrive at the mound where the bronze soldier stood. Below the statue, a crypt. Inside, mosaics showing Soviet soldiers receiving flowers and gratitude from liberated peoples. Every element reinforced the message: Soviet sacrifice, Soviet victory, Soviet benevolence. 1,200 workers, 200 stonemasons cutting and placing granite, 90 sculptors working on various elements, 3 years of labor. The technical challenges were significant. The bronze soldier alone weighed 70 tons and required engineering innovations to cast and erect. The mound beneath it was artificial, requiring careful construction to ensure stability. The underground crypt needed ventilation and structural support. The memorial opened May 8, 1949, 4 years to the day after Germany's surrender. The timing was deliberate. Everything about this monument was deliberate. But here's what you need to understand. When the monument opened in 1949, it wasn't connected to Nikolai Masalov. The official story described it as a tribute to Soviet soldiers generally, to their sacrifice, their courage, their magnanimity toward German civilians. The soldier holding the child represented an ideal, not an individual. Vucetich, the sculptor, said this explicitly in interviews at the time. The figure was symbolic, a representation of how Soviet soldiers behaved, not a portrait of a specific event. So when did Masalov enter the picture? Not until the 1960s, 15 years after the rescue supposedly happened, 19 years after the monument opened. Here's what happened during that gap. Nikolai Masalov went home after the war. He wanted to work as a tractor driver, the same job he'd had before being conscripted, but his war wounds were severe. Injuries, concussions, damage that made physical labor difficult. He ended up working as a housekeeping manager, essentially a janitor, at a kindergarten. He wasn't destitute, but he wasn't celebrated either. He was one of millions of Soviet veterans trying to rebuild lives in a country that had lost 27 million people. For nearly 20 years, nobody connected him to the Treptower monument. He didn't know, his neighbors didn't know, his co-workers didn't know. The monument stood in Berlin, and Masalov lived in obscurity. Then, according to multiple sources, Masalov bought a box of matches. In the Soviet Union, matchboxes often featured images, propaganda, cultural icons, monuments. The matchbox Masalov bought showed a photograph of the Treptower Park soldier holding a child. Masalov looked at it and thought it looked familiar. The posture, the uniform, something about it resonated. Around the same time, 1964, Red Star newspaper published excerpts from Marshal Chuikov's forthcoming memoir. The excerpt described a Soviet sergeant rescuing a German child during the Battle of Berlin. It named Sergeant Nikolai Masalov. Suddenly, people made the connection. The matchbox, the memoir, the monument. Masalov became famous. Interviews, newspaper articles, official recognition. In 1969, sources claim he was awarded honorary citizenship of Berlin, though this is verified by only limited sources. He received awards and medals for his wartime service, though notably he never received Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest honor. Perhaps because his story surfaced too late. Perhaps because the official narrative had already been set and retrofitting it was complicated. But here's the question historians grapple with. Did Chuikov write about Masalov because he remembered the event from 1945? Or did he write about Masalov in 1964 because by then the Soviet state needed a specific named hero connected to that monument? The Khrushchev era was different from the Stalin era. Less about symbolic ideals and more about individual heroism and personality. The political needs had changed. A faceless symbolic soldier fit Stalin's narrative. A named humble veteran fit Khrushchev's. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss what comes next. Because we need to talk about the problem with Chuikov's account. Meanwhile, authorities tried to find the girl. If the story was true, the child rescued in 1945 would be in her late 20s or 30s by the 1960s. She'd remember something, even if details were hazy. The East German government announced a search. "Find the girl from the monument," 198 German women responded. 198. Each claimed they'd been rescued by Soviet soldiers during the Battle of Berlin. Authorities investigated each claim, and here's what they found. The vast majority of the stories were true. Soviet soldiers had rescued these women when they were children. The soldiers' names, units, dates, and locations were verified through military records. In many cases, the soldiers died shortly after the rescues, killed in the continued fighting. So acts of mercy happened. Soviet soldiers did save German children multiple times. But which one was connected to the monument? Which one was Masalov? They never found her. Every investigation led to a different woman, a different soldier, a different story. The girl Masalov supposedly rescued, the 3-year-old blonde child whose mother died at Potsdamer Bridge, was never identified. She might have been among the 198 respondents, her specific story indistinguishable from dozens of similar accounts. Or she might not have survived the chaotic weeks after the rescue, or she might never have known she was rescued. Too young to remember, raised by relatives who never told her. The monument stood, the story spread, but the girl remained a ghost. Now we get to the part where this story becomes a case study in how history works and doesn't work. Because what happened in the years after Chwikov's memoir is a masterclass in narrative, counter-narrative, and the politics of memory. First, let's address the elephant in the room. Yevgeny Vuchetich, the sculptor, never changed his story. In interviews given before his death in 1974, he consistently maintained that the soldier and child were symbolic, not based on a specific event. Not a portrait of Nikolai Masalov or anyone else, a representation of an ideal. Multiple independent sources document Vuchetich saying this: German historians, art critics, journalists. The sculptor's intent was clear. The monument was propaganda in the purest sense, shaping belief through symbolic imagery, not documenting literal events. So we have the sculptor saying one thing and the marshal saying another. Why does this contradiction exist? Here's the most likely explanation, and it's more interesting than either simple truth or simple lie. The monument was created as a symbol in 1949. Stalin wanted a propaganda piece that communicated Soviet virtue. It worked brilliantly. Millions of people visited. The image spread globally. The soldier with the child became iconic, but it was always meant as an ideal, not history. By the 1960s, the political landscape had shifted. Khrushchev's de-Stalinization campaign emphasized individual heroism over abstract collective mythology. The Soviet state needed stories about real people doing real things, not Stalin-era symbolism. Chwikov's memoir, published in 1965, provided exactly that. A specific soldier, a specific date, a specific act. The fact that the story emerged 20 years after the event and 15 years after the monument? That's awkward, but not disqualifying. It's entirely possible that Masalov did rescue a child, that Chwikov witnessed it or heard about it at the time, and that Chwikov later connected that memory to the monument, even though the monument wasn't originally meant to depict it. Retroactive attribution. The statue existed for one reason, and the story got attached to it for another reason, and over time the two merged in public consciousness until they became inseparable. This is how historical memory works. Events happen. Stories get told about those events. The stories change with each telling. The political needs of the present shape how we remember the past. And eventually, the story and the event become impossible to separate. But then came 1999. and everything got messier. A German journalist named Horst Ruckert started investigating Soviet rescue stories. One prominent tale involved a soldier named Trifon Lukyanovich, who supposedly rescued a girl during the Battle of Berlin and died doing it. Writer Boris Polvoy had documented it. There was a memorial plaque at a different location in Berlin. The story was widely believed. Ruckert discovered Lukyanovich never existed. The whole thing was fabricated. Polvoy, the writer, had invented him for a propaganda piece. The story had been repeated so many times that it became accepted fact. But there was no military record, no death certificate, no documentation of any kind. Lukyanovich was fiction. The German-Russian Museum Berlin-Karlshorst confirmed Ruckert's findings. The memorial plaque came down in 1999. The exposure was embarrassing, a reminder that Soviet-era stories needed verification, not blind acceptance. That's when officials decided to honor Masalov specifically. If Lukyanovich was fake, they needed a real hero. In 2003, they installed a bronze plaque at Potsdamer Bridge, near where the rescue allegedly occurred. The plaque explicitly states that Masalov was the prototype for the Treptower Park monument. It was unveiled on December 10, 2003. What they believed was the second anniversary of Masalov's death, though even his exact death date is uncertain. Records conflict. Some sources say 2001, others say 2004. The plaque attendees included Dr. Peter John, director of the German-Russian Museum, and representatives from the Russian embassy. This was official. This was meant to be definitive. Masalov's story was real. The Treptower monument retroactively commemorated him, except the sculptor never said that, and Chuikov only said it decades after the fact, and the rescue, while plausible and possibly true, lacks contemporaneous documentation. I've linked resources in the description where you can dive deeper into the archival research and see the conflicting evidence for yourself. Check those out if you want to trace this story through primary sources. So, what do we actually know? Here's the honest assessment. Something happened at Potsdamer Bridge on April 30th, 1945. German civilians were trapped. Soviet soldiers were in the area. Multiple witnesses confirm acts of mercy occurred during the Battle of Berlin. The 198 women who came forward prove that. Whether Masalov specifically performed the rescue described by Chuikov is less certain but plausible. Whether that rescue had anything to do with the monument's design is almost certainly no. The timing doesn't work, and the sculptor explicitly denied it. What we have is a real event, a symbolic monument, and a later attribution that serves political and emotional needs, even if it's historically questionable. That doesn't make it a lie. It makes it something more complicated than a lie. It's mythology in the making, where truth and meaning blur together. Now, let's talk about the darker context, because if you visit Treptower Park today, you'll see graffiti, protests, tension. In 2022, vandals painted bloodstains on the monument and wrote messages, "Ukrainian blood on Russian hands," and "Putin equals Stalin." The monument has been targeted multiple times, especially after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And here's the uncomfortable truth about why. The monument has also been called, by some Berliners, the Tomb of the Unknown Rapist. That's a brutal nickname, and it exists for a brutal reason. Soviet soldiers committed widespread sexual violence during the conquest and occupation of Berlin. Conservative estimates suggest hundreds of thousands of German women were raped. Stalin reportedly dismissed it as a trifle compared to Soviet war deaths. The Red Army leadership did little to stop it. So when locals look at that statue, the Soviet soldier as protector, as merciful savior, Some see propaganda masking atrocity. The monument says liberation. Their grandmother's experience said occupation. This doesn't erase the genuine acts of mercy. The 198 women rescued by Soviet soldiers were really rescued. Masalov, if his story is true, really did risk his life for a child. Those things can coexist with the mass violence. War contains multitudes, heroism and horror, sometimes from the same army, sometimes on the same day. Share this video with someone who appreciates how complicated real history is, because the simplest stories are usually the least true. What the monument represents has shifted across 8 decades. In Stalin's time, it was pure propaganda. In Khrushchev's era, it became a tribute to individual heroism. After German reunification, it became a contested site where German memory and Russian memory collided. Today, it's a flashpoint for debates about Russia's modern behavior judged against its historical narrative. The statue hasn't changed. It's still 12 meters of bronze, still showing a soldier and child, still standing on a broken swastika. But what it means keeps shifting. That's the nature of monuments. They're not history. They're how we argue about history. Nikolai Masalov died in either 2001 or 2004, depending on which source you trust. He lived quietly after his moment of fame in the 60s, worked his modest job, raised his family, never achieved the highest Soviet honors, and remained, to the end, uncertain about whether that bronze figure really represented him or just the idea of him. Maybe that's the most honest conclusion. The monument shows who the Soviet Union wanted its soldiers to be. Masalov, if his story is true, showed who at least one Soviet soldier actually was. Those two things overlapped enough to create a compelling narrative, even if they weren't identical. Let's bring this home. You started this video with a simple question. Did a Soviet sergeant rescue a German girl, and did that rescue inspire a monument? 30 minutes later, you know the answer isn't simple at all. Here's what we've established. April 30th, 1945, the same day Hitler died, Soviet forces fought through Berlin's Tiergarten district. A child's cry was heard from no man's land. According to a marshal's memoir written 20 years later, Sergeant Nikolai Masalov crawled under fire and rescued a 3-year-old girl whose mother had been killed. Masalov survived the war, returned home, and lived in obscurity for 2 decades before his story emerged. Between 1946 and 1949, Stalin ordered construction of a massive memorial in Berlin's Treptower Park. 1,200 workers built it. The central statue, a Soviet soldier holding a German child, became iconic. The sculptor said it was purely symbolic. The marshal later said it depicted Masalov's deed. Both men were right, in their way, because the monument served multiple purposes across multiple political eras. 198 German women claimed they'd been rescued by Soviet soldiers. Most of their stories checked out, but the specific girl Masalov rescued was never found. In 1999, another rescue story was exposed as complete fiction, leading to a 2003 plaque honoring Masalov specifically at Potsdamer Bridge. You now understand how a single act of courage, real or not, became propaganda, became legend, became contested history. How monuments tell us less about what happened and more about what people needed to believe happened. How the same statue can mean liberation to one generation and oppression to another. Here's what I want you to do with this knowledge. Next time you see a monument, any monument, ask 3 questions. Who built it? When was it built? And what were they trying to make people believe? Because monuments aren't neutral. They're arguments in bronze and stone. They're claims about the past meant to shape the future. The soldier and child in Treptower Park will stand for decades or centuries more. The arguments about what they represent will continue, and that's actually good. History shouldn't be settled. It should be questioned, examined, complicated. Simple stories are for propaganda. Complex truth is for people who care enough to look deeper. Before you go, click that subscribe button and hit the bell. Because in my next video, I'm revealing another World War II story where the official version collapsed under scrutiny, and what replaced it was somehow even more unbelievable than the myth. You won't want to miss it. Thanks for sticking with me through this complicated journey. I'm grateful you care about truth enough to sit through 30 minutes of nuance. That's rare these days. I'll see you in the next one.